little bit about them, and you don't have to go through the pain and suffering of watching the same things over and over again. And I can tell you what the debates were about. What would you do with abortion if you have no power over it except for nominating Supreme Court justices? What will you do about gay marriage? What do you think about contraception? What do you think about the personality conflict of Ron Paul? What do you think about Ron Paul? How far do you disagree with Ron Paul? Ron Paul, what do you think about the Federal Reserve? This is most of what the debates have been. There have been very few questions about jobs, the economy, foreign policy. I don't think I've heard a debate moderator mention the Arab Spring once yet. Okay? Nothing about terrorism, nothing about Russia. Okay? Haven't talked about these things. It's almost as if the moderators had no idea of what was going on in the world around them. For 3 or 4 debates in a row, a moderator had an extended conversation with Ron Paul about eliminating the Federal Reserve. Now, you may think this is a wonderful idea. Some of you probably do. There may be a compelling argument for it. But for most voters, that is way down the list of the priorities in this election. Right? Elections are primaries, debates are navel-gazing. That's what they've become. Sort of look at this little bitty thing and ignore the really, really big elephant in the back of the room. And voters stop paying attention. Even as a political scientist, after a while, I gave up on the debates. I admit, I didn't watch several of them, and there have been so many that it was easy to miss some. One night, I watched one on a Saturday night, woke up, went to church, came back home, and realized that I'd actually missed another debate in the intervening period because they had a debate Saturday night, and they had another one Sunday morning. Turns out everyone else also missed that Sunday morning debate because they thought, goodness, at least we should get 3 days of a break before the next one. Related to this is the increasing length of campaigns. We don't vote for president for 9 more months, but the candidates have been running for over a year. If political scientists get tired of the extraordinarily long campaigns, why shouldn't the general public? Finally, a lack of perceived influence. As the size of the government has grown exponentially in the last 60 years, the distance between the elected and the voters has grown. People see very little opportunity to influence policy, so they see very little reason to get involved. And as in anything else, habits are hard to break. Once you get in the habit of being unengaged with politics, it's hard to get back into it. Lastly, sorry, I said finally a minute ago, gerrymandered districts, congressional districts, 98% of congressmen win re-election. 98%. Now, part of that is because they're pretty good at knowing if they might lose, and they tend to retire. But part of it is the districts are very much gerrymandered. And what do I mean by that? The districts are oriented so that in many congressional districts, 65% of voters are Republican or 65% are Democrat. And it's very unlikely that a candidate will be upset. So when we have big elections and say the House switches in 2010 as it did, there are only about 40 seats that were competitive in the House of Representatives. It just turned out that the Republicans won almost all of those. Right? But many congressmen had nobody running against them, or somebody that nobody had heard of, that nobody was going to vote for. Okay, where are we? On the other hand, none of these national issues can explain low turnout in local races. But turnout in local races is far worse than turnout in national races. I suspect this has to do more with the fact that in general, the public expects most important things to be done by the federal government rather than by local and state governments. So what, if anything, can be done to increase voting participation? Often, at the top of this list for political scientists is more TV broadcasts of debates. I think this has something to do with the natural bias of academics towards policy arguments. But I have my doubts, as I've already suggested, that this would actually work. Certainly, having more of the type of debates like those in the Republican primary seems unlikely to work. I think a serious problem with the contemporary debates is not just the issues that they focus on, but the fact that for the moderators, the incentives are all wrong. If you're a reporter who gets lucky enough to ask questions at a debate, the way to make your career is to ask a question that embarrasses a candidate, because you're going to be on TV for a week, which means you have very little incentive to ask a question that actually deals with a real policy issue. What your incentive is to get a got you moment. Right? And that's what the debates are about. That's why Mitt Romney has done relatively well in the debates, because he's kept his mouth shut except when he said exactly the same thing, and he hasn't said anything that sounds really, really crazy. Right? That's not useful in terms of engaging the public. It has led to debates being as much about the moderators as about the candidates. I think in one debate a couple of weeks ago, Diane Sawyer, as one of the moderators, spoke more than about half of the candidates did. Another common suggestion is shorter campaigns, especially for presidential primaries. This might have some benefits. However, it's unlikely to happen, partly because the parties that run the campaigns don't have enough authority within the election system because we have such a candidate-centered electoral campaign system. All right, this is all a real problem, I think, because civic and political participation is really important for the health of democracy, and critically, nonviolent civic and political participation. I don't want to get too political here, but I've been struck by the different responses in the past 3 years to the Tea Party movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement. There are issues with each, but it is striking that so many in the political, media, and academic circles really laughed at the Tea Party movement and rejected it as illegitimate, whereas within those same circles, the Occupy Wall Street movement, at least for a while, was praised. Violent protests are the opposite of participatory democracy. The use of mob power to intimidate fellow citizens in public has more akin to soccer hooliganism than to democratic actions. This is one reason why I am skeptical of much of the Arab Spring. It is difficult to see how some of these movements will be able to change from essentially violent mobs to working democracies. On the one hand, one can ask how else could they have overturned their autocratic governments? On the other hand, it is worth noting that in most of the areas of the Arab world that have had serious unrest, that unrest has been primarily limited to young men between 16 and 40 who are unemployed and unmarried. That is precisely the population that in every country in the world commits most of the crimes and commits most of the trouble. That is not really a stable group to build a democracy on. Okay, on that somewhat depressing note, let's turn to the discussion of whether or not the United States should actively promote democratic growth around the world. I want to talk about a few things that Larry Diamond discusses, but I want to also say contest several areas of conventional wisdom about democratic change. First, the world is not inevitably moving towards democracy. There's been a great deal of movement in that direction, but there are still plenty of countries that show no sign of becoming democracies, and not infrequently, countries that have become democracies go back to being autocracies. Samuel Huntington put together a nice chart that shows this back in the early 90s. By his count, in the 1920s and 30s, some 20 countries that had been democracies, that is most of Eastern Europe, reverted back to autocracies, and another 20 or so did so in the 50s. Even now, one can argue that Russia is on the verge of returning to an autocracy if it was ever legitimately a working democracy. And unfortunately, it is entirely possible that the same thing could happen in Iran and Afghanistan, and arguably has happened in Pakistan in the last few years. Second, economic growth and capitalism do not inevitably lead to democracy. China may become a democracy, and it may not. At this point, I think it would be premature to bet either way. And it will not become one simply because the middle class, the upper middle class, has become wealthier. Finally, I generally reject the claim that certain countries, people groups, ethnicities, or religions are simply incompatible with the idea of democracy. 60 or 70 years ago, many were skeptical of the idea that African or Asian countries could establish working democracies. And yet some have. At the same time, culture matters. And if the culture of a country has never had a tradition of anything other than centralized one party or one person control, it's very hard to see how they can establish a working democracy. This is one of the reasons I'm skeptical of China's moves towards democracy. This also relates to the issue of pluralism that I mentioned earlier. If for religious or cultural reasons a society cannot accept the legitimacy of opposing views, it's difficult to see how they can actually have a working democracy. So, should the United States support democracy around the world, and if so, how? Diamond notes that early on the United States wanted to avoid foreign entanglements and simply reaffirm democratic principles. He quotes John Adams, who says, "Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be America, her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." This is true, and a number of the founders thought this. It's also true that a number of them disagreed. For example, Thomas Jefferson strongly disagreed with this view and was a huge fan of using both the military and covert actions to support American interests and promoting democracy in other countries. In general, though, early on, the United States was much less involved in foreign affairs than it is today. The case for promoting democracy is in part moral and in part practical.